Good morning, everyone. Many thanks for joining us on this webinar, TRIZ for the Post-Pandemic World. My name is Rob Austin-Goodall. I'll be moderating this. I'll be handing over to Daryl Mann in about a minute or so to deliver this. First, again, I want to thank you all for, for turning up today. For those who have been here in the last 5 minutes, and haven't as yet, please be aware you have a chat box on your right hand side. If you can't see the chat box, if you hover over the main screen that has the slide on at the moment, you'll see a number of buttons at the bottom of the screen. There is one with a speech bubble in it. If you click on that, that will bring up the chat box. By all means, as we go through this webinar, please ask any questions in the chat box. Make sure you're addressing it to all participants in the drop down there, so everyone can see, and more importantly, we can see what your question you're asking or what point you have to make. Through the webinar, there may be a number of discussion points that you want to add your thoughts to. What we'll do is at the end, we'll look at all the questions that we have and we'll do a question and answer session at the end. Darren may answer, or you may get answers to the questions as we go through. Just for those who want to see us as in this virtual world, that's myself and Daryl. And what I'll do now is I'll hand over to Daryl to carry on. I'll just pass in the presenting rights. Okay, there we go. So over to you, Daryl.
Fantastic, Rob. Thanks very much, and thanks everybody for joining. Yeah, happy to take questions as we go through. If I don't spot them on the chat screen, then hopefully Rob's going to collect them and we'll try and get to them at the end of the session. So let's get stuck in. So I always describe myself as the luckiest person on the planet, and I think that's true. So these are some of the companies that we get to work with, trying to do innovation work, and I think it's fair to say that with all of them, it's been a struggle. And I think the reason for that is that the dominant mode of thinking for most organizations in the last at least 10 years, and for some organizations many more than that, has been optimization, so continuous improvement. And the horrible paradox that comes with that is the better we are at operational excellence and the continuous improvement stuff, the worse we're going to be at the innovation job, which I think gives companies a big contradiction. I think there's also a lot of confusion about what we mean by the word innovation. So I know one or two people may have seen me talk about this, but just for a second or two, as I'm talking, there's 18, shall we say, candidate innovations. How many do you think you can see? Hopefully most of those things that people will recognise. One or two you may not. So down at the bottom is Colgate's beef lasagna from the 1970s. So that's lasagna that cleans your teeth. Just above it is the Tata Nano. Next to it, Google Glass. Quite a few of Elon Musk's things. SpaceX, Hyperloop, Tesla, Airbus A380. Up at the top is James Dyson. That's his dual drum washing machine. Next to that, Tour-Track. Below, Tweel. So when I ask this question, I use this slide quite a lot, but when I ask the question, the range of answers is typically from 0 to 18, or some people will say hundreds. The actual answer I propose is 2, certainly the definition of innovation that we use. And that definition is basically 2 parts to it. And the first is there was some kind of a step change. And the second is it was successful. So it's very easy to generate a step change. So all of those solutions a second ago had a step change there, but not all of them were successful. In fact, the majority of them have lost money, usually unretrievably, or may still have a chance in the future, but haven't innovated yet. So what's happening there, and here's another example of how the world struggles with the innovation agenda. So this is something that Bain do every year. This is effectively a return on investment on R&D spend, R&D being a reasonable proxy for innovation. Usually makes fairly depressing reading, so this one here is particularly depressing, I think, if you're an innovator. So this is how much did we spend on R&D, and then the vertical axis is what was the impact of that in terms of growth of the organisation. If any of you are mathematicians and I asked you to draw the average through those blue dots there, I think the only sensible answer is the average is right on the origin. So in other words, it doesn't really matter how much you spend on R&D, the average impact is going to be zero. The problem with looking at data like this from an operational excellence perspective, which is what I think most people do, is that we look for averages. And in innovation world, the average is rarely of any value. You only learn stuff when you go to the extremes. So for those of you that have never heard of TRIZ before, what's TRIZ all about is go and look at the outliers, go and look at people, in this case, at the top of the picture, and ask, what did they do? Did they do something different to the average, to the other organisations on the planet? Now, fortunately, when you go and ask those questions, and the TRIZ database these days is about 11 million case studies, then you find there are some very clear patterns in what successful organisations did that the majority of people don't do. What you end up with from those 11 million is 98% of innovation attempts will end in failure. So they will not be successful by whatever the definition of success was that was used by the team, by the organisation that did it. For me, that's a fairly depressing number, but another way of thinking about TRIZ is, in effect, what it becomes is, what did the 2% do? And well, one of the things that the 2% did is they understood patterns. So here's a pattern that required a little bit of thought to unravel it. But if you look at the growth of growth of various different industries and products that are widely used in the world around us, what is the pattern here? Well, number one, things happening faster, so the number of people that get these particular products that goes from 0 to 100% much faster than it did do 100 years ago. But the bigger pattern is one of S curves, which are fundamental to the TRIZ story. So when we define innovation as a step change, it's all about a jump from one curve to the next curve. So S curves, if you imagine this particular pair of curves here, if I'm Alexander Graham Bell inventing the telephone, then that's the start of the left-hand S curve. There's a period of struggle at the beginning, not sure what to do, not many customers. Then we hit our stride, we get into the steep part of the curve, and then the flat part on the top says we get stuck. So even though we try to improve things, then it becomes progressively more difficult to do that. And it's only when somebody innovates, so for example, when landline telephony becomes mobile cellular, that we get some kind of a step change. Almost invariably, when that step change first appears, things get worse before they get better. And if we say that optimization is the engine that drives you up the S curve, and innovation is the thing that gets you to the next S curve, if everybody in the organization's got an optimization mindset, it's very difficult to convince anybody that things are going to get worse before they get better. So where we're at right now, and the reason most organizations are finding it difficult to innovate, is that having had decades of continuous improvement, almost everybody is stuck at the top of one of these S curves. And a lot of the managers and leaders that we speak to and talk to are very reluctant to be in a situation and find themselves doing things that make things worse. So one of the good things about crises is that everything's got worse. So it makes those kind of innovation decisions a lot easier to make, because we all now know that the standard rules of operation to a large extent don't apply anymore. TRIZ really is all about patterns, and what we see in that optimization mode, how we know things are at the top of the S curve. On the left-hand side left-hand side of this slide is management whack-a-mole. Yeah, my version of root cause analysis when we first go and talk to a new organisation is, does your job feel like this? And what's happening in whack-a-mole here is at the moment we're trying to reduce the costs, but when we reduce the costs, then the quality pops up, quality problems pop up. So we then hit the quality problem, then the delivery problem pops up. And if life feels like whack-a-mole, then it's a very clear signal that you're at the top of the curve. Another early warning, I think, was when 3M adopted Six Sigma in the early part of this century. So that's Business Week from 2007 and their innovation crisis. I think they learned fairly quickly that we can be a great innovator and adopt the wrong strategies at the wrong time and very easily kill that capability. We use this picture. We work a lot with companies that are doing Lean and Six Sigma, and talk about three phases of Lean. So the first phase of Lean, when companies first think about doing that, is what I call the low-hanging fruit phase. It's possible to find waste and remove it without any adverse consequence. Then comes the Lean with consequence phase. That's the whack-a-mole phase. So every time we try and eliminate some waste from the system, it's got an adverse consequence somewhere. And then there's a third phase of what I call dodo, which is basically we've stripped so much waste out of the organisation that we've got no resilience anymore. And I think we thought that most organisations were at phase 2 in this story, but I think what the pandemic has demonstrated is that it's rather worse than that. So it feels like, and the information we're gathering suggests that around about 50% of industries and organisations are at that dodo lean stage. They've stripped out so much waste that made themselves very fragile when the system around them gets perturbed, as it inevitably has been thanks to the pandemic. So where does TRIZ come into this story? Well, TRIZ, I think, is the tool set for doing the innovation job, and the way we often describe our role to our clients is we kind of sit in that space between the S-curves. When organisations have crossed the threshold and been forced to find better ways of doing things, trying to find the next S-curve, then TRIZ is the thing that allows us to do that in a more systematic way than let's just try stuff, which is it's something that we've seen a lot of at the moment. So in keeping with the idea of patterns, then this is a well-known pattern. This is not a pattern that was uncovered by TRIZ, but it's certainly a part of the TRIZ story. This is the disaster cycle, which gets used by a lot of aid agencies, and this particular version of the picture comes from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration in the US. But it's a pattern that we can see in almost any situation where there is a crisis. So there's the pre-disaster phase, working from left to right. Impact the disaster happens, so pandemic starts. Then we get an emotional high comes after that, the heroic and the honeymoon phase. And I think we're seeing that very elegantly at the moment with the pandemic, the tremendous way in that people have rallied together. So in the UK, 1 million volunteers to go and help the NHS, for example. So I would say we're right in the middle of that honeymoon period at the moment. But if we are, then what the cycle then tells us is that we head towards disillusionment, followed by reconstruction. So that disillusionment, let's dig a little bit deeper into what that's all about. Just before I do that, these patterns, we're always trying to, in TRIZ, get things down to first principles. In many ways, what TRIZ is let's reduce the world down to first principle level. And that disaster cycle is the collective version of the bottom right there, the Kubler-Ross grief cycle. So when all of us have a personal crisis, then we go through pretty much the same set of characteristics. The honeymoon in terms of personal is a denial very often, followed by frustration. Now that frustration phase, which comes immediately after the honeymoon and that plummet down to disillusionment, is a really important phase as far as innovation is concerned. In many ways, frustration is the mother of innovation. When we're trying to capture opportunities to innovate, frustration is the first thing that we go and look for. So what else do we learn from the pattern? So in the honeymoon phase, and I think I'll show you a few examples in a second, but what we get a lot of there is what are called expedient invention. So not the same thing as innovation at all, but rather in a crisis, a number of things go wrong, and it's necessary to rally together and find ways to fix the problem as quickly as possible. So in this country, I'll show you a couple of examples in a minute or two. Let's jump down to those second. So here's expedient invention. Lack of PPE, big problem, and so people like nurses, clinicians, healthcare professionals are great at improvising. So let's find a way of using bin bags, for example, as PPE equipment. Homemade ventilators using scuba diving equipment, etc. In various parts of the world, using underdeployed buses as ways of allowing homeless people to shelter. Heartwarming stories of fixing problems, but absolutely not innovation. I say very much the expedient stuff. The innovation actually comes later in this disillusionment phase, which is all about solving contradictions, which again takes us right to the heart of the TRIZ story. When we start hearing the frustrations from people, then those become the opportunities to identify contradiction, and as soon as we can do that, TRIZ tells us we can tap into the solution of other people. Is NHS dodo lean? I think we work with the NHS quite a bit, and I'd have to say yes, unfortunately. So this expedient invention is a testament to how a lot of the NHS, I think, works. Let's find workarounds to a system which is massively optimized and over-optimized for the situation it finds itself in. And what I mean by a situation it finds itself in is it's really important, I think, in any environment to understand the context in which you're working. So this is a slightly complicated picture, but it says that the world operates in basically 4 different ways. It can be a simple world, it can be a complicated world, it can be a complex world, it can be a chaotic world. That's what's happening along the horizontal axis on this picture. And I can take the same 4 ways of working and think about my system. So is my system simple? Is it complicated? Is it complex? Is it chaotic? And it's the combination of those 2 things which is really important for understanding what tools and what methods and what processes I should be using to try and fix any problems that occur. Now, for a long period, this drive towards lean and Six Sigma and optimization of systems means that a lot of organizations find themselves in that efficiency triangle, the green triangle on the left-hand side there, which means that we've simplified everything, got simple rules, simple instructions for people. It's very easy to train people, very easy to scale things up, and we make assumptions that the world is simple. And historically, that's been fine, just by restricting how you deal with the world. So a very simple example is if you think about Henry Ford and the Model T Ford. Any color you like, as long as it's black, is a great way of simplifying your world. Unfortunately, the reality for most organizations is, forget about the pandemic for a second, if there are human beings involved, and I usually say if there are 2 or more human beings involved, the situation is complex. And so a far more effective strategy for businesses is to be up in the golden triangle. So acknowledge that the world is complex and build processes that are consistent with that. Now, if we try and plot the disaster cycle onto that picture, then typically where organisations start is in the efficiency triangle. That's where everybody's effectively being told they would need to be. And when disaster happens, and certainly the impact, what that basically does is put everything into chaos. And the heroic action takes things out of chaos as far as the system is concerned, but tries to do things by adopting simple strategies. We use bin bags as PPE equipment, for example. But circling around that chaos and that complexity, hopefully what comes out of that, the big opportunity beyond disillusionment, is the reconstruction, which says we actually need to acknowledge that the world is complex and put in place processes that are consistent with that complexity. Yeah, process-driven, absolutely. So it's a different kind of process, I think, and a lot of lean stuff, unfortunately, builds processes that try and simplify things rather than acknowledge the complexity. So digging into that a little bit deeper later on. So in theory, there's lots of tools out there that are going to help us through this disaster cycle and help us to acknowledge complexity. What we've found over the years, we've had the opportunity to study all of these things, and usually in the context with clients. And this is basically what we end up with. So if I know which of these squares I'm in, then it should give me a pretty good clue what sort of tools and processes I should be adopting. So the sweet spot for certainly classical TRIZ is it's there for complicated problems, and certainly the roots of TRIZ, complicated technical problems. If we find ourselves in a complex world, then what we're looking to do is to ideally design safe to fail experiments. Let's try something. In a complex world, you can't know what the right answer is. There's no such thing as the right answer. So your job is to try something, learn from that, and build your next iteration as quickly as you can. And what TRIZ brings to that story is let's take a lot of the randomness out of that trial and error, such that we can give ourselves a pretty good indication of what will work and what experiments we should try. COBRA is a process that we built, which is again TRIZ based. Again, it's cyclical, and a lot of the clients that we're working with are building up a maturity to operate in complex environments. That's becoming the process that they tend to use. If we're in chaos, and some of you may be familiar with Colonel John Boyd and OODA, which is John Boyd was literally Top Gun pilot and a very successful one by all accounts. And his legacy is observe, orient, decide, act, and having that cycle of doing those four things faster than your opponent does it. But the trick is basically get out of chaos as quickly as you can. So job number one is survive. So I'm always conscious that it sounds like I'm a biased TRIZ person when I put this picture up, but from all the studies we've been doing over the years, even though most people have not heard of TRIZ, it very often is the thing that holds all the other tools together. Strategy is down at the bottom, just very quickly. It's a set of cards that we produced recently. It's a take on an original idea by musician Brian Eno. If anybody's interested, oblique strategies. A big part of the TRIZ story is think of somebody with an extreme version of your problem, and they've probably found a solution to it. And so artists, musicians, are prone very often to find themselves into chaos. I've got to produce an album in the next 6 months. I've got no idea what to do. And so oblique strategies was basically a series of provocations that when you find yourselves in those panic moments, help you to get out of the panic and into a more productive way of thinking. So if you do a Google search on either oblique strategies or strategies, you should find those cards. If any of you got a first edition set of the Brian Eno cards, They're selling for about £5,000 at the moment.
Daryl, just quickly,
Please.
sorry. Can you pop back to that? Yeah. There's a few questions just on the acronyms you've got on the screen, the COBA Plus and the OODA1. Just can you just go over what they mean again, please?
So OODA is Observe, Orient, Decide, Act. So that's basically, if you picture a fighter pilot in a dogfight situation, then that Observe, Orient, Decide, Act is basically the process the pilot is going through, and the pilot with the fastest cycle time is the one that wins. COBRA is a TRIZ-based process. So it's again, it's an acronym. So C stands for compass, so make sure you know where you're heading. O is for outcomes. What are the outcomes your customer is looking for? B is for bot. So what are the yes bots? R is look for the resources. What resources do I have available to me? And then the A is ands. So can I turn the bots into ands? That's where the heart of the TRIZ story comes in there. Let's dig a bit deeper into the TRIZ story. As I said, what TRIZ tries to do is distill the will down to first principles. Like a lot of major discoveries, and I think it's fair to say it is a major discovery. It happens by accident, and if you've never heard of TRIZ before, then the accident is a bunch of Soviet engineers at the end of the Second World War asked to go and find good patterns, and just being given that question forces you to determine what do we mean by good. What is the difference in a good one and a bad one? And what came out of that was a number of big ideas. The first of which is let's just put all the useful information into a database. So the idea of reducing the world down to first principles, go and study lots of things. And once you've worked out what good means, then that's what you put in the database. What it also means when you really distill things down to first principles is realizing that there are millions of ways of solving a problem badly, but a very small number of ways of doing it well. And if we get right to the essence of TRIZ, that tens of successful solutions. Once we've found a good problem, and in TRIZ terms, that means a contradiction. I'm trying to do this, and I can't do it because of this. The yes bot side of the story, then there are so far 40 strategies that are going to help you to get out of that kind of situation. Now, whether the end number is 40 or a higher number than that, the 40th strategy was added in the 1970s, so it hasn't changed since then, even though we keep looking. It's a very finite number of ways of solving a problem well, and the companies that use TRIZ the most. So if there's anybody from Samsung on the webinar, Samsung have trained getting over 30,000 of their people. Now, the first thing they get taught is make sure you understand those strategies so that when you are facing a problem, rather than randomly brainstorming answers, you can be much more specific about where you head and which directions are productive and which ones are not productive. Let's dig into that a little bit more. So here's obviously PPE equipment, and when staff have been asked to wear this stuff for long periods now, we start to get to frustration part. So entering the disillusion phase, it's not great. Using a bin bag as PPE equipment. If I've got a mask and at the end of a 12-hour shift, then it's highly likely that it's caused some damage to my skin. That's where the innovation opportunity starts to appear. You look at these kind of frustrations as a new problem arrives. That's when TRIZ says, you are not the only person in the world that's had that problem. Let's see how other people have tackled it. So there's a process of abstraction takes place. So here's four, let's say different problems. So on the bottom left is white finger. So a person that's been using power tools for a long period of time is likely to suffer from this disease. So a lot of people that work with power tools a lot these days are not allowed to use them for more than an hour a day, for example. Blurred photography, top left, top right is sun damage on fabrics, and bottom right, my old life as an aerospace engineer. So there's fretting fatigue leading to a fatigue crack. So if I look at those 4 problems and say, is there anything in common between those 4 problems, then most people's reaction will be, I can't see anything that is in common with them. But I propose that those 4 problems are the same problem, and this is how the abstraction part of TRIZ works. So let's have a look at the 4 problems in a little bit more detail. So blurred images in photography, sun damage to furniture, white finger, fretting corrosion. If you distill TRIZ down to a couple of questions when we're working on a problem, the first of those questions is what am I trying to improve? And that's the compass part of the story. And in all those 4 cases, we've got a harmful side effect. We've got a system that did something useful, but in the process of doing that, there was a harmful side effect. Question number 2 then is, once I know what I'm trying to improve, what's stopping me from making that improvement? Why can't I solve this problem? And I think this is one of those areas where the continuous improvement world and the operational excellence world has really struggled in recent years. It's almost like we need to run away from the difficult problems, whereas TRIZ says you need to run towards the difficult problems. Why can't you solve this problem? And I propose in all 4 of those cases, the thing that's stopping us is the amount of time that we need the system to be operated. So the sun damage of the furniture doesn't happen over across the period of a day. It's many days. What I've now found is a way of making 4 different problems all become the same problem. What I can also tell you is that if we look at all the tens of thousands of other people that have solved the contradiction between harmful side effects and duration of action, they've all used pretty much the same strategies to solve that problem. And so if I'm tasked with working on the mask problem, and how can I design a mask now that doesn't cause people irritation when they've been wearing it for 12 hours, then rather than randomly trying new mask designs, I can go and tap into these industries on the left-hand side that have already solved the problem, and find a much more effective and rapid strategy of getting to the good solution. So I'll come back to what that looks like in practice in a second. Here's the basic TRIZ model. We start on the left-hand side with a problem. We're trying to get to a solution. How do I get there? Well, traditionally we'd brainstorm. TRIZ says somebody out there has already solved the problem for you. So job number 1 is go and find them. Go and find a problem like yours. And once you've done that, the job of my research team, the TRIZ researchers, is take all those generic problems and find the best generic solutions to them. So that's where my 11 million database comes in. And then the final job is where the domain experts come into play. Again, so a lot of our work with clients is us saying, okay, well, here's the generic solution, here's what other people have done to solve this problem. Now can we translate that generic solution back into something which specifically fits the context of your situation? So pretty much all of the TRIZ tools work in that way as an abstraction. Go and find somebody who's done some hard work for you, and then bring back what they did and apply it in your situation. Again, trying to take the randomness out of the process. So 98% of innovation attempts fail, 2% are successful. If you look at the 2%, they've got elements of all these 5 things. Now, I've not got time to go through all of them, but let's just have a look at a couple in a bit more detail. So on the left-hand side, it's the contradiction story. And if you wanted to take away one word from this webinar, that's probably the word to take away, I would say. That what the pandemic has done already, I think, is makes the contradictions very vivid in life, and every one of those contradictions is an opportunity to innovate and find a better solution. Let's have a look at 1 or 2 of the other ones in a bit more detail. So this is, as far as the COBRA process is concerned, here's the compass. TRIZ calls it ideality. And that basically says that every industry, every domain has got a very clear direction of success. If we define things in terms of value, then value benefits divided by all the things we don't want. And if I want to be successful, then I should give my customers more benefits, less cost, and less harm. Hopefully that's not a great surprise to anybody. I think where it gets interesting from a TRIZ perspective is to say, okay, well, if there's a direction of success, there's also a destination. Then that destination is what TRIZ calls ideal final result. All the benefits, none of the cost, or in other words, free, perfect, and now. Everything evolves to free, perfect, and now. If you take this idea and go back to the idea of someone somewhere solve your problem, I think I hear a lot in this country is, does that mean it's going to take away my creativity? And I've noticed somebody asked the question. I would say absolutely the opposite of that. What the abstract solutions from other domains does is gives you a direction to focus your creativity. So rather than randomly brainstorming something, think in this direction. But if people don't put their creativity in, nothing's going to come out of the process. Now, I still like to say to myself occasionally that I don't need to. I'm not going to use TRIZ to solve this problem. I'm going to do it the way that Edward de Bono taught me, for example. Guaranteed when you're finished, when you reverse engineer what you've done, it fits the TRIZ pattern. So it really is a case, I think, of bringing efficiency to the story. Yeah, we can do things the random way, but I think what a crisis period does is it says, I need to find more efficient ways of doing this stuff. Any more trial and error is not an acceptable way of doing things, so especially when we understand that certainly in this part of the world, it's the East that's adopting TRIZ more than anybody else is doing. 30,000 people at Samsung, for example. One of the things that this compass direction, this free perfect now gives us is a map of where we need to be heading. So this metaphor here, which is a post they use at Samsung a lot until recently, the cheese is the ideal solution. So make sure you know where the cheese is. If you know where the cheese is, that tells you which walls to knock down in the maze. The metaphor there, of course, is that the walls are the contradictions. So the innovator's journey is know where you're heading, identify which contradictions are stopping you from getting there, and then one after the other, you knock those contradictions down. Another implication of this, which I'd have to say, working with clients in operational excellence mode, a lot of them get very threatened by this kind of picture. But what happens in a crisis period is you get a lot of things disappearing from the world and being replaced by other things. So I've always been very wary of, particularly this version here, showing this in front of FMCG clients, detergent manufacturers, because it's not what they want to hear. But if you think about everything evolves towards ideal final result, and if I'm thinking about laundry, the ideal final result is my clothes clean themselves. Now, whether the detergent manufacturer likes it or not, they have to move from left to right across that picture. They have to deliver more benefits, less cost, less harm. And so does the washing machine manufacturer. We've got to make a better and better washing machine. But the other player in the game is the textile manufacturer. And they've got to make a better and better textile. The whole idea of evolution towards an ideal final result is that process is convergent. By definition, the ideal final result is a point. And that means that not all of those players can make it all the way to the end. And I think if you think about, out of those three players, which one is going to win, the inevitable conclusion is it can only be the textile manufacturer that wins that game. Now, if you're a detergent manufacturer, then that's not good news for you. That's why a lot of the FMCG companies don't want to look at this picture. But it's the same for the washing machine company, and perhaps not so bad for them because they can probably displace the detergent manufacturer before they get displaced by the textile manufacturer. But what this kind of picture does, and if we draw this picture for any industry, you very quickly see who the winners and losers are going to be in the long term. And I'll say what crisis periods do is they accelerate that. let's move on a little bit. Functionality, it's really what the customer wants. What TRIZ has done here is to say function is a really stable way of looking at the world. It's also a really good way of organizing information. So a fairly standard TRIZ exercise is this one here, how to get the water out of the glass. And yeah, it's typically something we do as a 5-minute exercise. I'm not going to do it as an exercise here because I'm sure one or two people have done it already. But if you think about the idea of abstraction, there's the specific problem. How do I get the water out of that glass? The generic version of that problem is how do I move a liquid? And as soon as I make that translation to it's a move liquid problem, then the TRIZ database says, look, there are lots and lots of ways, if I look across different industries, of achieving that move liquid function. The database, or there's several of the databases actually, there's a free one at the bottom, that URL there. The way the database works is there's a drop-down menu. So on the top of this screen here, you'll see the page that you'll get when you go to that website. There's a drop-down menu of functions. So show me all the ways of heating things, show me all the ways of separating things, protecting things, etc. And click the yellow button, and it'll come back and say that yeah, these are all the ways the world knows of solving that problem. Again, trying to take the randomness out of the process and pointing you as quickly as possible to someone who's done some hard work for you. Let's jump to the contradiction story quickly. Perhaps come back to the masked problem. So when the original TRIZ researchers were looking for what they find is a good patent, the most vivid thing that stands out from that analysis is good patents are ones where the inventor saw a trade-off that everybody else was making and said, I'm not going to make that trade-off. I'm going to find a way of having my cake and eating my cake as well. So the database that comes out of that is, there's the worst slide of the morning, but that's a tool that TRIZ called the contradiction matrix. So that's where my 11 million data points go. What's happening on that matrix down the side is a menu of things that I'm trying to improve. And across the top, things that prevent me from making the improvement. So there's that pair of questions. Again, what do I want? Why can't I have it? The yes but moment. Typically, what I find is that when somebody announces their beautiful but inevitably fragile new idea, it very quickly gets shot down by everybody. Yeah, but that will be too expensive. Yeah, well, that will take too long to develop, etc. And that's usually the end of your idea. From a TRIZ perspective, when you hear those yes buts, that's really innovation gold dust. I would say that those yes buts are telling you what the contradictions are. So I love it when we're doing live sessions when people start using the yes but expression, because it's given us a very clear steer towards these are the real problems. And as soon as we've found those real problems, then this tool basically says, okay, well, someone somewhere solved them. So let's just very quickly have a look at the here's the menu. So this is the tool for technical problems. There's another business problems. There's another one for IT problems. They work in the same way, but the menu of things that we're trying to improve changes. So here's the menu for the technical problems. So with the abstraction process is basically finding things on this list that relate to your problem. So my mask irritation problem, there's no specific words here about mask irritation, but yeah, parameter 31, object-generated side effects, that's where we would map that particular problem in order to start tapping into people that have already solved this particular type of problem. I don't want any side effects, and duration of action is what's stopping me from solving that problem. As soon as I found that pair of things, then you can't see it inside those squares because they're too small, but each square's got a series of numbers in it, and those numbers relate to the strategies that other people have used to solve this particular type of problem. And one of the lovely things of having lots of data is you can give a priority ranking to those things. So again, this idea of efficiency, if I've got limited time to solve the problem, then the most likely strategy that's going to solve it for me is number 15. If I've got a bit more time, then I can start looking at the next one and then the next one and the next one. And ultimately, if I'm feeling very dedicated, I can go through all 40 of these inventive principles. The CRIZ basically is us. So it's the CRIZ team and now our team that developed those tools. Yeah, we've still got the research team in place that continues looking at patterns. These are the 40 inventive principles in TRIZ. The current reward for anybody in the research team that finds the 41st strategy is $250,000. So if anybody on the webinar thinks they can find a 41st strategy, then let me know. And if you have, then $250,000 is on its way to you. If you do a Google search on 40 inventive principles, you'll find there's a number of different databases of these principles for different industries and for different domains, usually with examples. That's something else that we try and update. There's a very nice biology one for those interested in biomimicry. Yeah, what we tend to do, so let's just have a look at one of the principles in a bit more detail. So this is principle number 13, which says we're going to solve the problem by just doing the opposite of what everybody else does. And what we try and do in those databases is just collate a few examples, hopefully fairly vivid ones that stick in people's minds to illustrate how the principle gets used. So, for example, if you go look at Starbucks, what's the core innovation at Starbucks? You go right back to the beginning of their evolution when it's just one cafe. What makes them become an enormous operation relative to all the other cafes in Seattle? And so a strategy is in principle number 13, turn things around the other way. Make the coffee expensive. Well, that's basically their innovation. That's a very simple, safe to fail experiment. Let's put our price up tomorrow and see what happens. And what they very quickly realized is we're not in the coffee business at all. We're in the reward business. And a reward means that people have to spend too much on something. So when I talk about these TRIZ not being an impediment to creativity, rather a spark to it, the provocation is turn something around the other way. But TRIZ can't tell you what to turn around the other way. You've got to work out what that is. It could be, do I turn the staff around the other way? So DIC's last resort is another example of let's make all the staff treat the customers really badly, for example. But it requires some serious thinking effort to work out what is it that I should be turning around the other way. And the paradox that very often goes with that is very often the more ridiculous the answer sounds at first, let's be really rude to the customers, for example, the bigger the potential breakthrough is. But yeah, absolutely there as a supplement to creativity, one replacement of, and back to the mouse and the cheese. Yeah, when I solve those contradictions, then I'm making a jump in the direction towards that ideal final result. Solving one contradiction is a big part of the TRIZ story. What crises and crisis periods allow us to do is to look at a whole succession of those things. So if we know where the mouse is heading to, is there a pattern of walls in the maze that repeat across different industries? And that is, fortunately, yes, there are. So again, another job that the research team does is look at the evolution of different industry sectors. So this is the protection industry, for example. Look at things in chronological order. Look at the step changes. And then do that for lots of different industries. There's the job of cutting stuff, evolution of cutting, evolution of measurement. And if you do that enough times, this is the first pattern the Russians found actually at the beginning of the TRIZ story, trend called dynamization. It says things tend to start off as immobile, and then we add joints to them. More joints, we make things completely flexible. And then we may well go to a liquid or a gas stage, and we'll end up with some kind of a field. So the way that we can then use that as a way of accelerating the innovation process, if I come back to my mask problem for a second, then if I'm trying to think about, okay, well, how do I design a mask that is not going to irritate the wearer? All I've got to do is to place it on the trend. It's a flexible thing. And as soon as I know where it is, then the trend tells me, okay, well, based on other people that have been in that situation, the way they've solved those problems is they've moved to liquid gas and they've moved to field. And what that does then is, okay, well, let's if field is the ultimate solution, can I find a field that's going to protect the wear? If I can't do that, then maybe I step back to a liquid gas solution, as happened, for example, just going back to the armor example a second. If I'm trying to find a better solution other than Kevlar for stopping bullets, then the clue from the TRIZ trend is use a liquid, and there's somebody that's found a very elegant solution of using liquid to stop bullets. It's about really taking the randomness out of the process, and that's where we might, if we were working on the mass problem, start going to look at patent databases, for example, to the liquids and gases and fields that might help us to solve the problem. The field one, somebody's made the comment about science fiction. Can I find a field to stop the virus? Well, in a mass situation, I don't think so yet. We've had a look at this problem, but in terms of killing the virus, then ultraviolet, for example, is a very good example of a field, but it is extremely good at killing COVID-19. So all the world's ventilators that aren't filtering out the virus and they're pumping significant quantity into the ward, then there's a situation where using ultraviolet is a very effective way of solving a pretty big problem. The point I'm trying to make at this point here is not so much about specific solutions, rather than TRIZ saying, like, here's the directions that other people have been to be successful. So if you're looking for a rapid solution to your problem, then this is probably where you should start. At 98% of things fail, 2% are successful. So finally, just coming full circle and opening things up to questions a little bit. UV wins. Field always wins. I'm a mechanical engineer, so that trend's always a bad news one as far as mechanical engineers are concerned. It's always better to move electrons than it is to move atoms. Anyway, back to a disaster cycle. As I said, I think where we're at with COVID-19 right now is at the honeymoon period, perhaps just past the honeymoon period. We've had this community cohesion. I think a lot of innovators have already been rubbing their hands with glee, saying, right, this is our time now. But homeless people in school buses and bin bags for PPE equipment is not innovation. It's the frustration that starts to appear now that becomes the impetus and the valuable start point for the innovation job. So I think the innovator's job really does begin in the next few months when the frustrations become very visible. And what TRIZ says is, whenever you found those frustrations, you've just found the contradiction. And contradiction is where innovation really comes from. 98% of innovation attempts fail, 2% are successful. If you look at the 2% of people that have been successful, nearly all of them, it's about 90% of those successful people were successful by solving a contradiction. And so that's why I think TRIZ, where I think TRIZ sits in the heart of this crisis period that's coming up. My belief is that the disaster talks about an anniversary reaction period. Personally, I believe that what the pandemic is doing is triggering a number of other dominoes to start falling over. So I don't think that we're going to be at the end of the crisis period in a year's time. I think it's going to be 3 or 4 years before all of the dominoes that have fallen over settle down again. But I'm absolutely convinced that that 3-4 year period is the time for the innovators. I think after that, things settle down again. It's all about S-curves again, and what the pandemic has triggered is the world has jumped off its current S-curve, if you want to think about it that way, and is now trying to find its next S-curve, and it's going to take 3 or 4 years to do that job. That sounds like a fairly depressing way of ending, which is not the intention. But anyway, let's back to the 2% of people being successful. There seem to be 3 elements there that are needed to do that. I need to understand what my customer wants. That's the frustration part primarily. I need to then deliver a more ideal solution. And something I haven't really talked about, but the business side of TRIZ is addresses this, but that's the ability to execute. You know, I can have the best idea in the world, and it can be a real customer problem, but if I can't execute that solution, then it's no use to me. I've got to get all those three things right. So it's the center of that Venn diagram where innovation happens. We're very fortunate to teach a number of one-day workshops with the IMechE, 2-day workshops, 5-day workshops. Those books there are the core text that we use on those workshops if anybody's interested in finding out more. With that, Rob, shall I hand it back to you?
Please, yeah.
There you go. Thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you, Daryl. Thank you everyone for that. We've got a few minutes left, so we'll come up with some questions that have been appearing over the last hour or so. But first, you can see we do have a virtual TRIZ session that you can book. The first face-to-face session, again, hopefully will be in December in London. Carry on the next slide. We also, in these uncertain times, have a number of virtual and e-learning portfolio that includes some e-learning, that includes delivery of various different virtual sessions. And we also have a huge collection, I think it's now towards 40, of free webinars that can be downloaded. And periodically through the session there, you'll see my colleague has put the link on to get access to the free webinars that way. So let's move on. We've had a few questions, Daryl. Start at the beginning, shall we? If you find an average R&D at 98% of innovation to be low growth or fail, does this promote businesses to wait and copy other leading ideas for a smaller profit, as the profit percentage with no R&D spend is higher and easier?
Yeah, it's a good one. Yeah, I think the simple answer to that is, yeah, being a fast follower is a fairly safe strategy. And I think, you know, if you can picture every industry in the world on the top of their S-curve at the moment, then there's a lot of watch and wait. You know, let somebody else jump off the cliff first and see what happens, and then we'll follow what they did and execute faster. I think that in a crisis period, that becomes a very dangerous strategy, because what happens in the crisis period is speed becomes a really big factor. Nobody knows what the right answer is anymore, but all the evidence says that, you know, the people that are able to make the jump to the new S-curve first become the giants that prevail for the next 50, 60 years. You've only got to look at what happened at the end of the last cycle, which was the end of the Second World War. The organisations that came out of that were successful for a very long period of time. So I think being a fast follower continues to be safe, but there's an opportunity when the whole world makes a jump to really win big. And I think some of the smarter innovation companies on the planet are understanding that, and are doing some quite big stuff. And you know, the bigger the jump happens, the more difficult it is for the fast follower to copy those things.
Yeah, sort of following on from that, is there any statistics on innovation using TRIZ and the percentage of those that have failed?
Yes, there is, and it's not great reading, honestly. Earlier on I described the picture, that the complexity landscape picture, which I know somebody mentioned Kinevin. It's the same basic parameters as Kinevin, but we've added a second dimension to it. You need to look at your system and you need to look at the environment around you. TRIZ was built in a world which is complicated. So if you're looking at a complicated problem, so TRIZ inside organisations, the very first Samsung case study was basically a manufacture problem, which is a complicated problem, and that case study very quickly saved Samsung $92 million. A lot of innovation problems are inevitably complex problems, and the original classical TRIZ was not built for complex problems. So it's if you look at classical TRIZ and complex problems, its failure rate is 98%. if you look at what's happening with Cobra now, where we've got a TRIZ-based process which is consistent with complex environments, then we're hitting much higher numbers now. So the clients that we're working with that have adopted that, we're sort of at the 50% success rate now.
Good, thank you, Darryl. Darryl, could you give an example of a Dodo lean company? Just to give some context.
I could go to almost any industry. I think automotive is, for me, the iconic example. And you can look at any automotive OEM, and in fact, go down to tier 1, tier 2, because they're the ones that have been adopting Lean Six Sigma thinking for the longest. They're literally the machine that changed the world. Every subsystem on a vehicle is right at the top of the S curve. And you look at the idea of logistics, which are just in time. You've got 3-day car, 5-day car, and it makes in the world we live in now, the whole thing's a nonsense. In crisis periods, fewer and fewer customers decide to make investments in big capital intensive products. So the winners there are going to be the Ubers, the Lyfts, the Olars of the world. People don't need to buy a new car, but they do need to get from A to B. And so the disruption there is going to come from, I say, the Ubers and the Lyfts. People that have already effectively seen what the customer actually wants. And I think the OEMs are almost paralyzed. I mean, until recently, I've not been able to have a single meaningful discussion with any OEM about who should be in the mobility business. So I think they're really going to suffer.
Couple more. Is your agnostic view about Lean based on research? About the most successful and profitable Lean organizations like Toyota?
Yeah.
A large element of Lean is process driven, which is what you say is required for the golden triangle. Yeah,
Toyota is one of the better OEMs, but I still think the big mistake they still make is they think they make cars. That is their business model. The world wants mobility; it doesn't want cars. One of the best TRIZ books is called The Ideal Solution. It's from Toyota University, but it doesn't use the word TRIZ in it anywhere. But we've done a fair amount of work with Toyota over the years. I think they're one of the more enlightened ones in terms of at least solving contradictions internally in manufacture processes, for example. But from a business model perspective, they're as stuck as anybody else is.
Which sectors are more suited than others to TRIZ?
I've not found a place yet where we've not been able to use it because it's because TRIZ has distilled everything down to first principles. Those first principles are literally universal. So we've been doing sessions in primary schools, for example. We've done sessions in the Pentagon, in the States. Every industry, from nuclear to diapers, because everybody's facing contradictions. That really is the heart of the innovation story. It's find the contradiction and solve the contradiction. That's the first principle that connects everybody together.
Final one. Where could I find out more detail about the contradiction matrix parameters and innovative principles? Yeah,
if you do a Google search, then do a Google search on contradiction matrix. The only thing to be aware of there is there's the original Russian version, which was produced in the 1970s. That's free and it's got no copyright on it. But it's a decent place to start. If you want to find the latest versions, then do a search on Matrix 2003, Matrix 2010. If you go to TRIZjournal.com, then the 2003 Matrix is free. And if you go to, if you do a Google search on Matrix 2010, then you get the latest version.
Brilliant. Actually, one more then. Can something be a failure today, but a success in the future?
Oh, sorry, I lost your voice, Rob.
Can something be a failure today, but a success in the future?
Yeah, really good question. Yes, absolutely. I think one of the most difficult things to get right in the innovation world is timing, and it's where we're putting most of our research effort right now. I would say is getting that timing question right. I would say the overwhelming majority of the pioneer companies get the timing question wrong. They're too soon. But to give you a simple answer to a really big question, it's tracking frustration. So another search that people might want to do is Pancentric, which is a really great way of tapping into customer frustrations and understanding what those frustrations are and how big they are and how they're changing.
Brilliant. Thank you, Daryl. We've just gone slightly over time, but important questions that need answering. Thank you for your time, and thank you for everyone that's joined us. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for the feedback as well.